"Oh, I wish Mr. Hatfield hadn't proposed so soon," said Rosalie to Matilda the next day at 4 o'clock. She was looking out through the window at the fields. "Now there is no reason to go out and nothing to look forward to," she added. "It's a pity you were so hard on him," said Matilda. "He'll never come again, and I think that you actually rather liked him. I hoped that you would marry him and leave all the other men free for me to flirt with." "Well, I'm sorry to lose Mr. Hatfield, I have to admit, but there will be other men like him, I suppose. It's Sunday tomorrow. I wonder how he'll look and whether he'll be able to read his sermon. He'll probably have to pretend he is ill and to make Mr. Weston give the service." "No, he won't," said Matilda. "He's a stronger man than that." Rosalie was a little offended by Matilda's comment, but it seemed that Matilda was right. Mr. Hatfield spoke during the church service as normal, but he never once looked towards where the Murray family were sitting, and he did not leave the church until we had gone. Rosalie was clearly disappointed that he had not looked at her once. However, she said, it proved that he was thinking of her all the time, or he would have looked at her if only by chance. But if he had looked at her, she would have said it was because he thought her so beautiful that he had no choice. After a few more days of being bored at home, Rosalie asked me to walk with her into the village. She said that she needed some new pencils for her drawing. Really, I think she wanted an excuse to see Mr. Hatfield or flirt with some other men. I have to admit that on the way, I also started to wonder whether we might see Mr. Weston in the village. While Rosalie was in the shop buying her pencils, she made me stand by the door to tell her if anyone interesting passed by. No one did, apart from 2 of Rosalie's friends, who stopped and chatted to her for a while when she came out. While they were talking, I walked a little way down the street to look in a nearby shop. After only a few minutes, Mr. Weston appeared beside me. "You were alone again, Miss Grey," he said. "Yes, but only for a few minutes while Miss Murray talks to her friends," I told him. "But aren't they your friends too?" he asked. "No," I replied. "I don't really have any friends here in Horton." We stood for some time talking in a friendly way. We discussed all sorts of things, and he asked me what type of books I liked to read. He listened carefully to what I said, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed interested in my answers. Why would he be interested in what I liked to read and in what I thought and felt? My heart started to beat faster when I thought about the answer to that question. Soon Rosalie arrived and saw that I was talking to Mr. Weston. Rather than being cold to him, as I expected, she smiled and talked to him with unusual cheerfulness. The 3 of us began to walk along the country road towards Horton Lodge. Before long, Rosalie was talking to Mr. Weston in such a way that there was no space in the conversation for me. I started to feel upset by this as I listened to her speak so confidently to him. She smiled at him, laughed at what he said, and swung her fair hair from side to side. After a while, the road divided, so we said goodbye to Mr. Weston and turned towards Horton Lodge. "I thought I could do it!" cried Rosalie once we were some distance away. "Do what?" I asked. "I have shot him through the heart," she said. "He will go home and think of nothing but me." "How do you know?" I questioned. Oh, there were many things that gave it away, she told me, but especially the way that he looked at me when he said goodbye to us. It was such a gentle, caring look. Ha! He's not quite as stupid as I thought. I did not answer. My heart felt as if it was in my throat. I was worried that if I spoke I would cry. Please do not let this happen, I said silently to myself, for his sake, not mine. As we continued the walk back to the house, all I could give were one-word answers to Rosalie's cheerful chatter. I was in shock, and I wanted to go straight to my room and cry. The next Sunday was one of the greyest days of April, with dark clouds and heavy rain showers. I went to church with Rosalie, and despite the recent conversation between Rosalie and Mr. Weston, I was still very much looking forward to seeing him and hearing him preach the sermon. It was raining heavily, and as we were leaving the church, Rosalie said that she wanted to wait inside the door for the carriage. Of course, a few moments later, Mr. Weston came to the door, and Rosalie started a conversation with him. She asked him if he would come and see a young girl who was ill and who lived in one of the estate cottages. He promised that he would go to see her the next day. "And what time do you think you might go to see her?" asked Rosalie. "I'm sure her mother would like to know so that she can tidy up the house and make you feel welcome. Perhaps I could come and introduce you to them." Rosalie, who usually only thought of herself, had suddenly become helpful and generous. Mr. Weston said that he would try to be there at 11 o'clock in the morning. I felt sure that this was just an excuse for her to meet him again. The carriage had now arrived, and the footman was waiting with an open umbrella to help Rosalie get into the carriage. Straight away, Mr. Weston stepped forward and offered to cover me with his umbrella. "No, thank you, I don't mind the rain," I said. I always said the most stupid things when I felt shy and did not have much time to think. "But you don't actually like the rain, I suppose?" he replied, with a smile that showed me that he was not offended. I could not disagree with that comment, and so I allowed him to cover me with his umbrella as I walked to the carriage. He put out his hand to help me climb up the steps. Then he looked directly into my eyes and smiled as he closed the little door behind me. It was only a small smile, and it was only for a moment, but I saw in it, or I thought I saw in it, a meaning of great importance. It gave me more hope than I had ever had before that he might care about me. The next morning, Rosalie came into the schoolroom. "Matilda, I want you to go for a walk with me around 11 o'clock today," she said. I remembered that was the time Mr. Weston was going to visit the cottages. "Oh, I can't possibly go for a walk, I'm busy," said Matilda. "Miss Gray must go with you." "No, I want you to come," said Rosalie, and explained why in a whisper, so Matilda agreed to go. That night at dinner, the girls told me about their walk. They had bumped into Mr. Weston and had a long, enjoyable walk with him. They found him surprisingly pleasant and interesting, and he had clearly enjoyed walking with them too, they said. A few weeks later, Rosalie went to a party that she had been looking forward to since the winter. It was a ball at Ashby Park, and she wore an elegant dress for the occasion. Early the following morning, she came to tell me her news. Sir Thomas had proposed to her at the ball, just as she and her mother had hoped and planned. Rosalie was very pleased that she was going to become Lady Ashby, and Ashby Park would be hers. She also loved the idea of a big wedding, an impressive party, and a honeymoon, a special holiday after the wedding, that would be spent abroad. However, the one thing that she seemed disappointed about was the date of the wedding. It was planned to take place in only 6 weeks' time, on the 1st of June. This meant that she only had a few weeks more to flirt with other men and enjoy being free. During this time, she took every chance to meet Mr. Weston and tried every way she could to make him interested in her. She started to visit the poor cottages, simply because she knew that she would bump into him there. Of course, she never asked me to go with her. She persuaded Matilda to go with her instead, as she had done that first morning. She made sure that I stayed at home by asking me to copy out a piece of music or finish a drawing for her. I could not understand why she was doing this. If someone had told me how she was behaving, I would not have believed it. But I saw it with my own eyes and suffered from it too. During those 6 weeks, I was only able to go to church once or twice. Rosalie and Matilda found any excuse for me to stay at home. I was ill or had some work to finish in the schoolroom. On these days, when they returned home, they would sometimes tell me about the conversations they had had with Mr. Weston. "He asked if you were ill, Miss Grey," said Matilda one day, "and wondered why he never saw you with us any more. So we told him you were very well, but that you just didn't want to come to church and that you preferred reading your books at home to going out." I wondered what on earth he must think of me, but there was no point in arguing with Rosalie and Matilda, and if I disagreed too strongly with what they had said, then they would surely realise how much I liked and respected Mr. Weston. So I said nothing and kept my feelings for him a secret. I tried to feel better by telling myself that Rosalie would soon be married and gone. In a few weeks, I would be able to spend the holidays at home. During this time, I heard that Mr. Weston and Mr. Hatfield could not agree on anything. This did not surprise me, as they were as different from each other as two men could be. But I was shocked to hear that because of this, Mr. Weston was soon going to move to a different job in another place. What if he had left Horton by the time I returned in the autumn? I could not stop thinking about him. It seemed that I may not ever see him again, and this made me feel desperate and alone. There were 2 other things that added to my problems at this time, one small and one much more serious. I was told that Snap, my rough but bright-eyed little friend, was going to be taken away from me and given to someone in the village to look after. The second thing was that each time I received a letter from my sister Mary, she told me that my father's health was a little worse. This worried me very much. He had not been at all well the last time I had seen him. I could not help feeling that something terrible was going to happen. The first day of June arrived, and Miss Rosalie Murray became Lady Ashby. She certainly looked beautiful on her wedding day. After returning from the church, she came running into the schoolroom to see me. "Miss Grey, I am Lady Ashby," she said excitedly. "It is done. There is no going back now. I've come to say goodbye because I am going on my honeymoon now. I'm going to Paris, Rome, Naples, Switzerland, London. Oh, I will be away for months and see and do so much before I see you again. Goodbye. The carriage is waiting and they are calling me. She gave me a very quick kiss on the cheek and then began to leave. But then she turned, came back into the room and put her arms around me with more love and warmth than I had thought she was capable of. After this, she left with tears in her eyes. Poor girl. I really loved her then and chose to forget everything she had done that had hurt me and others. She had not really known what she was doing, I felt sure. I hoped with all my heart that she would be happy with her new life. Now that Rosalie had gone, I had much more free time, and I started to visit the cottages again. I went to see Nancy, partly in the hope that she could tell me about Mr. Weston, but she had not seen him for a while. I have to admit that I even stayed a little longer at her cottage in case he came to visit, but he did not. Sunday came, and I was able to go to church and hear Mr. Weston preach. It had been several weeks since I had been to church, and I was happy to be able to see him and listen to him. I walked home afterwards with Matilda, but he did not come to talk to us, and nor did he walk home with us. Matilda was as disappointed as I was that we had to walk home alone. Now that her sister had got married, Matilda had started to think about when her time would come to do the same. Mrs. Murray, too, had time to worry about her younger daughter and to look for a husband for her. I was told that I must work extra hard because the young lady's manners needed to be much better. Matilda was told that she was no longer allowed to go riding every day or play with the dogs. Just when I thought my job had become much easier, it began to get harder again. In addition to long hours in the schoolroom, Mrs. Murray had decided that Matilda needed exercise and should go on walks every day. It was on one of these walks that Matilda and I saw Mr. Weston by chance. I had hoped this would happen for such a long time, but now I felt very nervous. My heart was beating very fast. I was worried that how I was feeling would be clear to both Matilda and Mr. Weston himself. However, I need not have worried, because he hardly looked at me, and spoke first to Matilda. He asked if she had heard from her sister, Rosalie. "Yes," she replied. "She was in Paris when she last wrote to us, and she was very well, and very happy, of course." After these last few words, she looked at Mr. Weston carefully, waiting to see what he would say. "I hope she will continue to be very happy," he commented, in what seemed like a sincere way. "Do you think it is likely?" I asked him once Matilda had walked away to look at some horses in a field nearby. "I don't know," he replied. "According to what people have told me about Sir Thomas, and from what I have seen myself of his behaviour, I have my doubts about Miss Rosalie's happiness. It is a pity that she has married him. Even though Miss Rosalie can be very thoughtless, she is so young and cheerful and, well, interesting. I suppose that she has married him because that is what her mother wanted her to do. Is that right?" "Yes, and it is also what she wanted, I think. She always laughed when I tried to persuade her not to marry him," I explained. "Well, if you told her not to marry him, then at least you know that you are in no way responsible if the marriage is an unhappy one," he told me. At that moment, Matilda appeared again. After talking for a little while longer, Mr. Weston said goodbye and continued on his journey down the road. However, just a few minutes later he returned with some bluebells in his hand. He offered the beautiful blue flowers to me and smiled. "I haven't forgotten how much you like spring flowers," Mr. Weston said, "even though I have hardly seen you over the last 2 months." He gave the flowers to me in a very simple, polite way, but it meant a lot to me. He had thought of me and had remembered the type of flowers that I liked. "Miss Rosalie and Miss Matilda told me that you were so busy reading and studying that you never left the house," he said. "Yes," said Matilda very quickly. "And it's true?" "No, Mr. Weston, don't believe it," I told him. "It's a terrible lie. Some young ladies say things which aren't true without worrying if it might upset their friends. You should be careful not to believe everything they say." "Well, I certainly hope that in this case it is a lie, Miss Grey," he said. "It would be a great shame if you chose to read and study so much that you had no time for anything else." Then we said goodbye again, and he left. You might be wondering why I have written down all of this detail. You may think it is not interesting enough to write about, but these conversations were important because they gave me hope. That evening, I spent time remembering how kind and thoughtful Mr. Weston had been towards me. I dreamt that night of his smiling face. The next morning, I woke up full of happiness, and I was not able to think of anything else other than him. Hope, however, can leave as quickly as it can arrive. Later that same morning, I received a letter from my mother which told me that my father was now very seriously ill. Just 2 days later, another letter came, this time from my sister Mary. In her letter, she told me that she thought my father was going to die very soon. I went straight to Mrs. Murray, explained the situation to her, and asked her if she would let me go home to my family. At first, she just looked at me. Then she asked me why I was so upset. My father may not be as ill as my mother and sister had said, she told me. And if not, well, we must all die one day, she added. Finally, she agreed to let me return to my family. I packed my things and left as soon as I could. It was a long journey, and it was 10:30 at night by the time I finally arrived home. My mother and sister met me at the front door. Both of them looked serious and were tired and pale. "Oh, Agnes!" cried my mother, and Mary started to cry. "How is he?" I asked. "Dead," came the reply. It was the answer I had expected, but it was still a terrible shock to me.